All right, so we're going to look tonight in our study of the prophets at Daniel, and I'm going to try to break it into two lessons, looking at the history part in the book of Daniel tonight, and then next week, Lord willing, look at the prophecies. But I want us to see that Daniel is in a large part overlapping with Jeremiah. We looked at Jeremiah last time, and Daniel covers quite a bit of the same time that Jeremiah did. But Daniel is in Babylon, whereas Jeremiah stayed in Jerusalem. The main messages in Daniel, even from the story that we see throughout the book, is that God is the one who gives wisdom. God is the one who reveals secrets. God controls the kingdoms. God's kingdom lasts forever. God is worthy of full trust. God has real power to save his faithful ones, and God is able to humble the prideful. And you may find some other messages like that, but I think these are some of the main messages we can find throughout the book. The first verses of the book of Daniel say, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel, and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans." So we're going to find that Daniel, as well as his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, better known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they are among these young men in whom there's no blemish. They're good-looking, they're gifted in all wisdom, having knowledge, and they're quick to understand. And just one thing I want to point out about that is pretty much all of those things are a gift of God. It's not that they have earned this position. They haven't earned this, being good looking. They haven't earned wisdom. They haven't earned being quick to understand. Maybe they've studied hard to gain some knowledge, but they are mostly just blessed by God to be like this. And so there's nothing that they can brag about with these things, that they were chosen. It's simply that God made them like this. And so in that position, they can do some good if they will choose to use it for that purpose, which we know these 4 did. It says from verse 5, "And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king." And it names Daniel and his 3 friends. And it says that the eunuchs, or the chief of the eunuchs, gave them these names. Daniel was named Belteshazzar, and the others Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In verse 8, it says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs." So we see that they're going to be there for 3 years of training before they actually get into the service of the king. So we skip over quite a bit of the time, but we also see that Daniel just decides, I'm not going to sin. Whatever the situation is here, I'm not going to defile myself by eating something that God wouldn't want me to eat. We're not told what was wrong with that food, if it was unclean meat or what. We don't know. We don't even know what was wrong with the wine, because in general, it was not sinful for the Jews to drink wine, but perhaps the alcohol content was more. I don't know. We don't know what was wrong there, but he purposed in his heart he would not defile himself with these things. It would defile him. And so he and his three friends stand firm on this, and they're able to do this because God brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. Again, and I'm sure part of this is because of the way Daniel behaves, because of his faith in God, but it is God who is blessing Daniel here. Daniel doesn't take credit for it. It is God who takes the credit for the chief of the eunuchs really liking Daniel and appreciating him. In verse 17, it says, "As for these four young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all wisdom, literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams." So we see again, these are not things they can just take credit for. Yes, they studied. Yes, they went through the training, and I'm sure they applied themselves to it because of their faith in God, and they knew this is what God would want them to do. But when they come out with knowledge and skill, it is God who is behind that. He's the one who gave that to them. And of course, with Daniel, he has an ability that you can't get through study. You can't get it through hard work. Understanding in all visions and dreams, the only way you can get that is God directly giving it to you, which he did to Daniel. He didn't even do that for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so they come in and they're tested before the king, and they find that Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were better than all the others. In verse 20, "In all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus." Okay, so we see this, that they are way better than the others, but it's because God blessed them to be better than the others in their wisdom and understanding. Yes, they applied themselves. Yes, they worked for it, but they can't take credit for it. If somebody's intelligent, it's because God blessed them with intelligence. God's the one who gets credit for it. Whatever situation we're in mentally, with our abilities, we just do with it what we believe God wants us to do. That's what they were doing. God blessed them, but that's so they could serve the Lord in this capacity. In chapter 2, when you get down to verses 4 and 6, the king has had a dream, and he calls in his astrologers and wise people and says, tell me the dream and the interpretation of the dream. And in verse 4 through 6, it says, "Then the Chaldean spoke to the king in Aramaic, 'O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation.' The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, 'My decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you will be cut in pieces, and your houses will be made an ash heap. However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation.'" All right, and so this is, of course, something impossible that he's asking them to do, to tell him what he dreamed, as well as the interpretation. And they tell him, "You need to tell us the dream so we can tell you the interpretation." And he says, No. You must make known the dream to me. If you don't, I know you're just lying. So tell me the dream, and then I shall know that you can tell me its interpretation. And in verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean." They're basically telling the king he's being unreasonable, right? It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. Now, they have gods that their dwelling is with flesh, right? They have idols. But they're saying they know that idols can't tell them anything. But there's some gods who don't live with them, don't live with flesh, who could tell you what it is, but they can't tell you because they don't live with us, right? So they can't get the answers. Only the gods could say what it is. And so they're partly right, except for the idea of there being multiple gods. But the king has declared that they must all be killed, and that includes Daniel and his friends, even though they didn't even know anything about this. But they're included in the wise men that are to be killed. And so we find in verse 20 and 23 of chapter 2, Daniel is praying. God has told him what the king dreamed and the meaning. And it says, "Daniel answered and said, 'Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his.'" And that doesn't just mean that God has wisdom and might. It means that wisdom and might also come from him, as we'll see in verse 23. And he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's demand. So, in praising God, Daniel says wisdom and might are his. And so when we have any wisdom or might, it's because God has given it to us. And he also talks about how God is ruling over the times, seasons. He's removing kings and raising up kings. God is behind those things. And so Daniel is recognizing that, and it's a major theme through the book. In verse 27 through 30, Daniel goes to the king, and he says, your magicians, astrologers, and so on could not tell you these things. But in verse 28, it says, "But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days." We're not going to talk about the dream tonight, the particular dream. I just want us to understand this point that is made in all of this. He calls God he who reveals secrets in verse 29. In verse 30, he says, "But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes who made known the interpretation to the king," right? So they'll survive, "and that you may know the thoughts of your heart." And so he's saying God is the one who reveals secrets. And Nebuchadnezzar also gets this. After he's told the interpretation of the dream, in verse 46, he bows down to Daniel. And in verse 47, the king answered Daniel and said, "Truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret." And then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. Also, Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat in the gate of the king. So they are very high up in government, not because they have done anything great, but because they're faithful to the Lord, and the Lord has used them in this way. And so they've gotten promoted because of their relationship to God, essentially. Now, in chapter 3, we find that Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. The picture that I'm showing here was taken by a friend of mine in Texas. This is a Hindu idol, but it's supposed to be the same height as the idol that Nebuchadnezzar made. Now, his was made out of gold. I don't think this one is made out of gold, but you can see approximately the size of that idol, what that would have been, as you see the people there standing around. All right, so he made this idol. He commanded that everybody bow down and worship that idol when the music is played. And in verse 11, whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. All right, and that's what they're being accused of now. Now, Daniel's not in the picture in this chapter, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are. And so these Jews that have been set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, they're accused of not paying due regard to the king. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. I just thought it was interesting to note that they don't say anything about the god, the idol, being worthy of worship. It has nothing to do with that. They know that the king just made this thing. This isn't about worshiping something that they truly believe to be a god. It's more of worshiping the king, right? It's about the king. He's the one who made that god. It's your god. You set up this image. And so they haven't paid due regard to you. And so it is the king here is trying to take too much worship. I don't know how else to put it, but he's trying to have himself be worshipped. He's lifting himself up to the status of a god by making a god. And that's true of anyone who makes a god. They have lifted themselves up to the status of God. If they can make a god, then they're greater than the god, aren't they? In verse 15 through 18, Nebuchadnezzar tells them, if I'll give you a second chance, right? If you're ready to bow down and worship the image which I have made, when you hear the music, then okay, it's fine. But if you do not worship, you'll be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? And so we find that they answer the king, and they don't say, okay, give us the second chance. They just say, it's never going to happen. We're not going to bow down. They say in verse 17, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. Even if they die, they're delivered from his hand, right? But they say, if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor do we worship the gold image which you have set up. We worship the God who's actually able to deliver us. And he can deliver us. He's able to deliver us from the fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, one way or another. And they didn't know if they would be saved from the fire, but they knew they would be delivered from the king. And so after they're thrown into the fire, the ones who throw them in die, but they're fine. Nothing wrong with them whatsoever. King Nebuchadnezzar calls them out. He calls them servants of the Most High God. And they come out. They don't even smell like fire. And in verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So he was very angry with them one moment. The next moment, he's promoting them, again because of their faithfulness to God and what God does for them. But he recognizes God is the one who did this. And there's no other God like that who can deliver like this. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar writes about his what God had done directly to him. He says, Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. How great are his signs and how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. And this is something that's repeated a lot in the book, this eternal kingdom, everlasting kingdom of God. And notice that Nebuchadnezzar thinks it's good. He doesn't say he was commanded to write this. He says, I thought it was good, and this is what God has done for me. And what was it? Well, it was humbling him. So I think we can skip over a lot of this, but he was given a dream. He had Daniel come and interpret it for him. And it was basically a warning that God was going to humble him, make him go crazy for some amount of time. And that was fulfilled about a year later. And when he finally repented, he blessed God and praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. God lifted him up again. But he says in verse 37, Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth and his ways justice, and those who walk in pride he is able to put down. The next chapter, we find his son, who doesn't seem to get the point. He drinks from the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of God and praises the false gods made of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. And when the hand writes on the wall, Daniel is brought in, and he tells him in verse 20, your father Nebuchadnezzar, when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And he went crazy. In verse 22, but you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this, and you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. And so he says, the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways you have not glorified. And so he died that night. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. And by this time, Daniel would have been probably 75 to 80 years old, because this is approximately 60 years after he came to Babylon. So if he was as young as 15, probably he was older than that. He'd be around 75. And if he was 20, when he was brought, he'd be around 80. So somewhere around there at this time. Now, I know I'm out of time to talk about the lion's den. I think most of us know that story pretty well, but we know that they had to try to get rid of Daniel through the law of his God, something related to that, because he was not corrupt in any way. And so he kept praying no matter what the law was. And the king hated to throw him in the lion's den, but he had to because the law was signed. And so the king says, your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. And certainly that did happen. God sent the angel and shut the lions' mouths. And Daniel said, I was found innocent before him, and I've done no wrong before you. Even though he broke that law, he didn't actually do anything against the king, and he certainly didn't do anything against God. And he was blessed because he believed in his God. And so the King Darius commanded that people tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, because his kingdom is one that shall not be destroyed, and he's one who delivers and rescues. So we see that God gives wisdom. Daniel was wiser than others, but that's because God gave him that wisdom. God reveals secrets. Daniel couldn't interpret dreams by himself, but God did give in the dreams and interpretations of it, so that he did reveal secrets. And God controls the kingdoms. He gave Nebuchadnezzar victory. He also took the kingdom away until he humbled himself, and he took the kingdom from his son because of his pride. And God's kingdom lasts forever. And these kings were recognizing this over and over again. And God is worthy of full trust. He saved from the fire, he saved from the lions, and he'll save us from hell if we trust him. And God is able to humble the prideful. And Nebuchadnezzar was even thankful for being humbled as he was. And so that's basically the story of the book of Daniel, skipping over all of the prophecy. All right, thank you.